December 1966. American F-4 Phantoms owned the Vietnam skies with superior speed, missiles, and technology. Yet they were helpless as agile MiG-21 slaughtered their bombers daily. The Phantoms couldn't outturn the MiGs, couldn't catch them, couldn't force them to fight. Then one mustached colonel realized something brilliant. He didn't need to outfly the enemy. He just needed to make them think he was slower, weaker, and delicious bait. What happened next became the deadliest air trap in history. The F-105 Thunder Chief pilot felt the weight in his gut as his bomb-laden aircraft lumbered toward Hanoi at 13,000 feet, December 19, 1966. His Thud carried 6,000 pounds of ordnance, turning what should have been a nimble fighter bomber into a flying brick. He scanned the sky through scratched canopy glass, watching for the glint that meant death. 200 miles away, inside a concrete bunker near Phuc Yen Airfield, a North Vietnamese ground control intercept operator stared at his Soviet-made radar screen. Green, phosphorescent blips crawled across the display like luminous insects. He'd learned to read these signatures the way a hunter reads tracks: speed, altitude, formation, and most importantly, the electronic emissions. Those bright halos around certain blips, that was the QRC-160 jamming pod signature. The Americans only strapped those pods to their bombers. Heavy, slow, vulnerable bombers. He keyed his radio. The transmission went to 4 MiG-21 pilots already airborne, circling at 20,000 feet like sharks sensing blood. The controller's voice was calm, almost bored. He'd done this dance dozens of times. The MiGs rolled inverted and dove. The Thud pilot never saw them coming. The first indication was his wingman's aircraft exploding 300 yards to his left, transformed instantly from a machine of war into a tumbling constellation of burning metal. Then his own radar warning receiver screamed. He jettisoned his bombs and yanked the stick, trying to evade, but a loaded Thud had the turn radius of a freight train. The Atoll missile's proximity fuse detonated 20 feet from his tail. Shrapnel shredded hydraulics, fuel lines, control surfaces. He pulled the ejection handles and rocketed into the sky above enemy territory, watching his aircraft tumble toward the rice paddies below. This wasn't combat. This was a shooting gallery, and the Thuds were the targets. By the end of 1966, the United States had lost 126 F-105s over North Vietnam, not to lucky shots or random encounters, but to a systematic slaughter enabled by Soviet radar technology and North Vietnamese tactical discipline. The Americans flew the most advanced aircraft on Earth. They had the F-4 Phantom, a machine that could exceed Mach 2, carried cutting-edge missiles, and boasted engines powerful enough to climb vertically until the atmosphere thinned to nothing. Yet none of that mattered because the enemy simply refused to fight them. The MiG-21 was smaller, more agile. With a turning radius the heavy Phantom couldn't hope to match in a classic dogfight. But the real advantage wasn't aerodynamic. It was informational. North Vietnamese controllers used their ground control intercept radars to distinguish between aircraft types based on electronic signatures before visual contact was even possible. The QRC-160 jamming pod, a bulbous attachment meant to disrupt enemy radars, ironically served as a perfect identification beacon. Its emissions were distinctive, unmistakable. Only the F-105 Thunder Chiefs carried them into combat, because only the bombers needed the jamming capability for their low-altitude penetration missions. So the North Vietnamese developed a doctrine of exquisite simplicity. Avoid the dangerous F-4s. Kill the vulnerable F-105s. MiG pilots received orders to engage only when they possessed overwhelming advantage. If their controllers identified Phantoms on radar, they stayed high or returned to base. If they identified Thunder Chiefs, they attacked with impunity. American F-4 pilots would race to intercept, missiles armed, fury driving them forward, only to find empty sky. The MiGs had already disengaged, vanished like ghosts, leaving only burning wrecks tumbling toward the jungle below. The frustration burned through the American fighter community like acid. They owned technological superiority but couldn't leverage it. They had the sharks, but the prey wouldn't swim into their waters. Colonel Robin Olds arrived at Ubon Royal Thai Air Force Base in September 1966 to take command of the 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, call sign Wolfpack. He was 44 years old, a relic from another war, with a handlebar mustache that violated regulations and a combat record that made enforcement of those regulations professionally awkward. He'd shot down 24 German aircraft in World War II, flying P-38 Lightnings and P-51 Mustangs in classical dogfights, where victory meant outflying your opponent in three-dimensional chess matches that lasted seconds and determined who lived and who died. Vietnam was different. His pilots returned from missions with full missile loads and empty hands, rage and humiliation carved into their faces. The enemy was winning not through superior skill, but through superior information and discipline. Olds spent his evenings studying intelligence reports, pattern analyses, mission debriefs. He was searching for the flaw, the weakness, the single thread that when pulled would unravel the entire enemy system. The revelation came in late December during a routine intelligence briefing. An analyst was explaining North Vietnamese GCI procedures, how their controllers differentiated aircraft types. The analyst mentioned the QRC-160 pods almost as an aside, noting that their jamming effectiveness was questionable, but their presence reliably marked bomber formations. Olds stopped him, asked him to repeat that. The pods were the marker. Not altitude, not speed, not formation patterns. The electronic signature was the primary discriminator. The North Vietnamese were reading the electromagnetic spectrum the way a bloodhound reads scent. They were hunting the electronics, not the aircraft. The solution crystallized in Old's mind with the clarity of a revelation. If the enemy used electronic signatures to identify prey, then you gave them the signatures they were hunting. You made your predators look like prey. You turned wolves into sheep, at least on the electromagnetic spectrum, and you waited for the enemy to bite. He called it Operation Bolo, named after the Filipino machete, a weapon of ambush and close-quarters violence. The concept was audacious to the point of absurdity. Install QRC-160 jamming pods on F-4 Phantoms, have them mimic every aspect of F-105 bomber missions, including speed, altitude, formation, and radio communications, and then wait for the MiGs to attack what they thought were easy targets. When the enemy committed to the engagement, they'd find themselves not facing slow bombers, but air superiority fighters loaded for combat. The plan required convincing multiple layers of command that strapping bomber equipment onto fighters wasn't insanity. It required maintenance crews to jury-rig installations that weren't in any technical manual. It required pilots to fly their high-performance fighters in unnatural, vulnerable configurations. Most critically, it required weather. Cloud cover had to obscure the deception until the moment of contact. If the MiG pilots got visual identification before they committed, they'd simply disengage, and the entire trap would collapse. Olds briefed his wing on January 1st, 1967. 56 F-4 Phantoms from the Wolfpack and supporting units would participate, organized into 7 strike packages spaced at precise intervals. They would fly at 450 to 540 knots, painfully slow for the Phantom's capabilities, making them vulnerable to ground fire and reducing their energy state for combat. They would maintain 13 to 15,000 feet altitude, the standard bomber envelope. They would use F-105 radio call signs and frequencies. They would even mimic the distinctive pod formation, 4-ship flights that the Thunder Chiefs used for mutual jamming coverage. Every detail mattered. A single deviation could alert the enemy, break the pattern, trigger suspicion. Olds was gambling that the North Vietnamese would trust their sophisticated Soviet radars more than their instincts, that the controllers would see what they expected to see and commit their forces accordingly. The briefing room was silent when Olds finished. His pilots understood the implications. They would be bait, flying in configurations that negated many of their advantages. If something went wrong, if the trap failed, they'd be vulnerable to the entire North Vietnamese air defense network. One captain asked what they should do if the MiGs didn't take the bait. Olds smiled around his mustache. The MiGs would bite. They always did when they smelled blood. January 2nd dawned with a 4,500-foot cloud deck over North Vietnam, exactly what Olds had gambled on. Thick enough to prevent visual identification, thin enough for radars to penetrate. Perfect ambush weather. At 1500 hours local time, the first wave of Phantoms led by Olds himself in a flight designated Olds Flight crossed into North Vietnamese airspace. Their QRC-160 pods radiated jamming energy into the atmosphere. Their speed was agonizingly slow. Their formation was textbook F-105. To the ground control intercept radars tracking them, they were indistinguishable from the bomber formations that had been coming north for 2 years. Inside the bunker at Phuc Yen, the controller watched the familiar signatures appear. 4 contacts, pod formation, electronic emissions consistent with jamming equipment, speed and altitude parameters, exactly matching previous bomber raids. His decision tree was simple. These were bombers. The MiG-21s at readiness received scramble orders. Pilots sprinted to their aircraft. Engines spooled up. Within minutes, multiple MiGs were airborne, vectored toward the American formation by controllers who had absolute confidence in their intelligence picture. The North Vietnamese pilots climbed through the cloud deck, their radars locked onto targets they'd intercepted countless times before. The American bombers would be in their vulnerable attack configuration, focused on their target run, predictable and slow. Standard doctrine called for a high-speed slashing attack from above, fire missiles, disengage before the escort fighters could react. Quick, clean, professional. At 15:02 hours, the lead MiG-21 element broke through the clouds at 14,000 feet, expecting to find F-105 Thunder Chiefs locked into their bombing runs. Instead, they found F-4 Phantoms in combat spread, AM-7 Sparrow missiles already coming off the rails. The confusion lasted perhaps 2 seconds, the time required for the human brain to reconcile expectation with reality. 2 seconds in air combat is a geological age. By the time the MiG pilots processed what they were seeing and began reacting, American missiles were already in flight, radar-guided weapons tracking targets at ranges where the MiG-21's superior maneuverability was irrelevant. Old's voice crackled across the radio frequency. "Lincoln, this is Rambler. Engaged." The first MiG-21 exploded in a sphere of orange fire as an AIM-7 Sparrow detonated its warhead 3 feet from the fuselage. The pilot never had time to eject. The second MiG broke hard left, pulling maximum G, trying to get outside the Phantom's engagement envelope. But Olds had fought in the era of guns and had learned the fundamental truth of air combat. Position beats maneuver. He'd entered the fight with altitude advantage, energy advantage, and situational awareness. The MiG pilot was reacting to a situation he didn't understand, trying to fight according to doctrine that no longer applied. Old's second missile tracked the MiG through its turn and killed it at a range of 2 miles, well before any theoretical dogfight could even begin. The North Vietnamese ground control intercept system collapsed into chaos. Controllers were screaming into radios, trying to warn pilots that the situation wasn't what it appeared, that they were engaging fighters, not bombers, that they needed to disengage immediately. But fighter radios in combat are saturated with calls, warnings, commands, and the simple, overwhelming cognitive load of trying not to die. Most MiG pilots didn't receive the warnings until it was far too late. The second wave of Phantoms arrived at 15:04 hours, then the third wave. The fourth. Olds had timed the packages to create a rolling ambush, fresh fighters entering the engagement as the initial flights expended their missiles. The MiG pilots found themselves trapped in a kill box with no good options. They couldn't outrun the Phantoms at their current energy state. They couldn't outturn missiles fired from advantageous positions. They couldn't escape to their airfields because more American fighters were cycling into the area. Captain Everett Raspberry and Lieutenant Daniel Lasagna scored a double kill, both MiGs destroyed within 30 seconds. Major Philip Combes shot down a fleeing MiG-21 that was trying desperately to reach the relative safety of Phuc Yen airfield. 3 more MiGs died to missiles fired by pilots whose names would be recorded in the mission reports, but whose individual actions blurred together in the chaos of multi-aircraft combat. 12 minutes after the first engagement, the sky over North Vietnam was empty of MiG-21s. 7 were confirmed destroyed. 0 American aircraft had been lost. No Phantoms had even been significantly damaged. The North Vietnamese People's Air Force had begun the day with approximately 16 operational MiG-21s, their most advanced interceptors. By 15:15 hours, they'd lost nearly 50% of that capability in a single engagement that lasted less than the time it takes to eat lunch. In the Phuc Yen control bunker, The GCI operators stared at their radar screens in stunned silence. Their system, the sophisticated Soviet technology they'd relied upon for 2 years, had been turned against them. The Americans hadn't defeated their radars through jamming or electronic countermeasures. They'd defeated them through deception, by exploiting the very sophistication that made the system effective. The controllers had seen exactly what they expected to see, and that expectation had killed their pilots. Soviet advisors arrived within hours to conduct a forensic analysis of the disaster. The conclusion was professionally humiliating. The Americans had identified a critical assumption in the GCI doctrine, the belief that electronic signatures were reliable discriminators, and had exploited that assumption with surgical precision. It wasn't that the radars had failed. The radars had worked perfectly, reporting exactly what was in the electromagnetic spectrum. The failure was cognitive, a systemic vulnerability to spoofing that no amount of technical sophistication could overcome if the enemy understood your decision-making process. The strategic implications rippled through the North Vietnamese air defense network. For the next 3 weeks, all MiG operations were grounded, while new procedures were developed. Visual identification became mandatory before engagement. Controllers lost their autonomy to commit aircraft based solely on electronic signatures. The entire doctrine that had made the People's Air Force effective was invalidated in 12 minutes. American bombers suddenly operated with a freedom they hadn't experienced in months. Strike packages penetrated North Vietnamese airspace without facing the coordinated MiG attacks that had characterized operations throughout 1966. The loss rate for F-105s dropped precipitously. Pilots who'd been flying into the teeth of a competent air defense system found themselves facing only surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft artillery, dangerous but manageable threats compared to radar-directed fighter interceptions. The 8th Tactical Fighter Wing, Robin Old's Wolfpack, became instant legends. When they returned to Ubon that evening, the flight line erupted in celebration. Ground crews had painted 7 red stars on the squadron board before the debriefing even finished. Olds himself had scored his first Vietnam kill, adding to the 24 from World War II, but characteristically deflected attention to his pilots and the intelligence analysts who'd provided the targeting data. The Pentagon publicity machine seized on Operation Bolo as proof that American tactical aviation could dominate the Vietnam airspace when properly employed. It became the first major air-to-air victory of the war, studied in classified briefings, used to justify procurement decisions, transformed into a doctrinal case study. The North Vietnamese adapted, as competent enemies always do. They attempted to run similar deception operations on subsequent missions, Operation Bolo II in January, and various iterations throughout the spring, but the conditions were never quite perfect again. The enemy had learned. Visual confirmation became sacrosanct. MiG-21 pilots developed new tactics that didn't rely on GCI omniscience. They imported additional MiG-17s, older aircraft less capable than the MiG-21, but also less dependent on sophisticated ground control for effectiveness. The air war settled into a grinding attritional struggle where neither side could claim dominance. American losses continued, though never again at the rates experienced in late 1966. The North Vietnamese rebuilt their fighter force and continued contesting the airspace over Hanoi, though with greater caution and less aggressive tactics. Robin Olds rotated home in September 1967 after completing his tour. He'd accumulated 17 confirmed kills in Vietnam, to add to his World War II total, making him one of the war's most successful pilots. He was promoted to brigadier general, though his relationship with the Air Force brass remained complicated by his contempt for careerists and his willingness to publicly criticize decisions he considered operationally unsound. He retired in 1973, but his legend only grew in the decades that followed. Fighter pilots spoke his name with reverence. His mustache became iconic, featured in paintings and photographs that captured the romantic image of the warrior scholar, the man who understood that combat was ultimately about thinking, not just flying. Operation Bolo's significance extended far beyond the 7 MiGs destroyed over North Vietnam. On January 2nd, it represented a fundamental shift in how military theorists understood modern air combat. The age-old emphasis on aircraft performance, pilot skill, and kinetic weapons was being supplemented, and in some cases supplanted, by electronic warfare, information operations, and deception. The principle was straightforward but profound. In modern conflict, perception often mattered more than reality. If you could control what the enemy's sensors reported, you could control their decisions. The North Vietnamese had built their air defense doctrine around the assumption that sophisticated radar systems provided reliable intelligence. That assumption was correct, until it wasn't. Once the Americans understood the system well enough to feed it false information, the entire structure collapsed. This wasn't a new concept in warfare. Deception has been a military tool since humans first organized violence. The Trojan horse, Hannibal's feint at Cannae, the Ghost Army's inflatable tanks in World War II, Operation Fortitude's phantom divisions before D-Day, all exploited the same fundamental principle: make the enemy believe something false, then profit from their misperception. But Operation Bolo demonstrated how deception could be executed in the electromagnetic spectrum with the same effectiveness that previous generations had achieved through physical means. You didn't need inflatable aircraft or dummy radio traffic anymore. You needed to understand the enemy's sensor systems well enough to spoof them, to present signatures that would trigger predictable responses, to turn their technology into a liability. The evolution of electronic warfare accelerated dramatically in the decades following Operation Bolo. The Vietnam War became a laboratory for developing jamming techniques, radar warning systems, and eventually the stealth technology that would revolutionize air combat. The F-117 Nighthawk, which entered service in the 1980s, represented the ultimate expression of Operation Bolo's core insight. Instead of temporarily deceiving enemy radars through mimicry, the Nighthawk was designed to be nearly invisible to them entirely. Its faceted surfaces and radar-absorbent materials reduced its radar cross-section to that of a large bird, making it effectively undetectable by Soviet-era air defense systems. When F-117s struck Baghdad during Operation Desert Storm in 1991, flying through the heart of one of the world's most sophisticated air defense networks without being detected, they were executing the same operational concept Robin Olds had pioneered 24 years earlier. They were exploiting the enemy's dependence on radar technology by controlling what those radars could see. The Nighthawk pilots didn't need to dogfight because the enemy never knew they were there until the bombs were already falling. Modern warfare has pushed these concepts into realms that would seem like science fiction to the pilots who flew Operation Bolo. GPS spoofing can make enemy navigation systems report false positions. Cyber operations can compromise command and control networks before physical forces ever engage. Electronic warfare aircraft can create phantom formations on radar screens, drawing air defenses away from actual targets. Stealth technology has evolved to encompass not just radar signatures but infrared, acoustic, and even visual spectrums. The underlying principle remains constant. Your enemy's sensors are your weapon. If you can control what they perceive, you can control their decisions. Modern military doctrine now treats the electromagnetic spectrum as a war-fighting domain equivalent to land, sea, air, and space. Electronic warfare officers are as critical to mission success as pilots. Billions of dollars are invested in technologies designed to achieve information superiority, the modern term for what Robin Olds accomplished with some borrowed jamming pods and tactical brilliance. The philosophical implications extend beyond military applications. In an age where information flows through digital networks at the speed of light, the ability to control, manipulate, or deceive those information streams becomes a weapon as powerful as any kinetic system. Social media disinformation campaigns, deepfake videos, coordinated bot networks, all exploit the same vulnerability that Operation Bolo exploited. Humans and systems tend to trust their sensors, and that trust can be weaponized. The defense against such tactics requires the same fundamental shift that the North Vietnamese were forced to make after January 2, 1967. You cannot rely solely on technical systems, no matter how sophisticated. Visual confirmation, multiple independent sources, skepticism toward information that confirms your expectations, these become necessary cognitive disciplines in an environment where perception can be manufactured. Operation Bolo proved that the F-4 Phantom didn't need to outturn the MiG-21, because turning fights were a problem set from the previous era of warfare. The relevant question wasn't who could pull more Gs in a sustained turn. The relevant question was, who could better exploit the electromagnetic battle space to create advantageous engagement conditions? The Phantom won not through superior aerodynamics, but through superior information warfare. Robin Olds understood this intuitively, perhaps because his experience spanning 2 wars gave him perspective on how rapidly the fundamental nature of air combat was evolving. The dogfights of World War II, where victory required outflying your opponent in visual range turning battles, were already becoming anachronistic by the 1960s. Vietnam was transitioning toward beyond visual range combat, where missiles, radars, and electronic warfare determined outcomes before pilots ever saw each other. The 7 MiG-21s destroyed on January 2nd represented more than a successful mission. They represented the death of an operational paradigm and the birth of a new one. Air combat would never again be solely about the aircraft. It would be about the entire system: sensors, communications, electronic warfare, information processing, and decision-making architecture. The side that could integrate those elements most effectively, that could see the battlefield more clearly and act on that understanding more rapidly, would dominate regardless of whether their aircraft could turn more tightly. In the final analysis, Operation Bolo's brilliance lay in its elegant simplicity. Olds identified a single assumption underpinning the entire enemy system: the belief that QRC-160 pods reliably marked bomber formations. He then exploited that assumption with minimal resources and maximum effect. He didn't need new technology, advanced weapons, or overwhelming force. He needed to understand how his enemy thought and processed information, then feed that system data designed to trigger a predictable, exploitable response. The lesson transcends the specific tactical situation over North Vietnam in 1967. It speaks to the fundamental reality that in any conflict, whether military, economic, or political, the side that better understands the other's decision-making architecture possesses a potentially decisive advantage. You don't need to be stronger, faster, or more numerous if you can make your opponent commit their strength inefficiently based on flawed perceptions. Robin Olds died in June 2007 at the age of 84. His obituary in the New York Times called him one of the Air Force's most iconic fighter pilots, a man who embodied the warrior ethos across 2 wars and 4 decades of service. Fighter pilots who never met him could recite stories of his exploits. That mustache, which he'd grown in defiance of regulations and shaved only after retiring, became a symbol of the independent-minded warrior who valued results over conformity. But his most enduring legacy isn't the 40-plus aircraft he shot down, or the decorations that covered his uniform. It's the operational paradigm he validated on January 2nd, 1967. He proved that wars are won not just by those who fight hardest, but by those who think most clearly about the nature of the conflict and how to exploit asymmetric advantages. The F-4 Phantom never could outturn the MiG-21 in a sustained dogfight. It didn't matter. What mattered was making the MiG-21 pilots fight a battle they couldn't win, on terms they didn't understand, against an enemy who looked like prey until the moment they became predators. That's not flying. That's thinking. And in modern warfare, thinking kills more efficiently than maneuvering ever could. The 7 red stars painted on the Wolfpack scoreboard represented 7 enemy pilots who died because they trusted their ground control intercept radars more than their instincts. 7 victims of a system that had been turned into a weapon against itself. It was the most successful air ambush in history, executed not through superior aircraft performance, but through superior understanding of how information warfare could reshape the tactical environment. Robin Olds proved that in the electromagnetic age, the best trick isn't to outfly your enemy. It's to make them believe you're something you're not until the moment they realize their mistake. By then, the missiles are already in the air, and the only question is whether they have time to understand what killed them before the warheads detonate. 12 minutes of combat, 7 kills, 0 losses, 50% of enemy fighter capability eliminated, and not a single turning dogfight required. Just one commander who understood that modern warfare happens in the electromagnetic spectrum before it ever happens in the sky, and who had the audacity to exploit that understanding against an enemy who'd built their entire doctrine around technological sophistication, without accounting for the possibility that technology could lie. If you enjoyed this story of military deception and tactical brilliance, hit that subscribe button to join our community. Drop a like if Operation Bolo impressed you, and let me know in the comments, what's the most brilliant military strategy you've ever heard of? Your engagement helps us bring more incredible war stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.